My name is Paul Lee, and I'm a product manager here at Google. For the past several years, my wife and I have had the pleasure of volunteering with the International Justice Mission. And today I'm privileged to introduce its founder and CEO, Gary Haugen. So who is Gary Haugen? I didn't fact check this, so we'll go with this. This is what the internet says Gary is. Gary's the youngest of 6 kids and hails from nearby Sacramento. During elementary school, he decided he wanted to be a lawyer, inspired by the examples of Lincoln and MLK. He played football in high school, and with the same crew cut he generously shares with us today. And in 1981, he departed for the lesser school on the East Coast, Harvard. After graduating in 1985, Gary traveled to South Africa during the apartheid era and worked with Michael Cassidy and Desmond Tutu at the National Initiative for Reconciliation. For those of you who were born in the 80s, this was during the apartheid era. And as an example of what it was like during that period, in one instance, Gary was detained by security forces for attending a multiracial church service without permission. This was the world at that time. In 1988, Gary started law school at the University of Chicago. And during that time, he worked for the Lawyers Committee on Human Rights. He investigated crimes like the Lupao massacre of 1987, which involved the execution of 17 civilians by soldiers in the Filipino Army. After law school, Gary joined the Department of Justice as a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division. Gary met his wife Jan during this time. They now have 4 kids. And in 1994, Gary was detailed to the UN Center for Human Rights, where he directed the UN's investigation of the genocide in Rwanda. I actually have on my computer, but didn't send it to Ruthie in time, a photo, my favorite photo that I've seen in the IJM office. It's a picture of a giant military camouflage helicopter in the background. Gary, dressed pretty much like he is right now, and scores of kids running towards him. And I asked the staff there, what is that photo? Because it's just kick butt to see this giant military transport and all these kids and Gary. It turns out that it was from 2006, his first trip back to Rwanda, where he visited a remote area that was part of his investigation. That time was pivotal. And if we go back to 1994, Gary, when he worked for the investigation, collected with his team testimony and physical evidence from 100 mass grave and massacre sites across the country. Allow me to share, because I can't do this justice, the New Yorker's description of his experience from an article they wrote about this in 2009. Gary was sickened to come across charred piles of bodies in a church where Tutsi had expected to find sanctuary. He took down the testimony of a father who saw his 3 small children hacked to death with machetes. At one massacre site, Haugen rolled back the decaying body of a woman and found the corpse of her child beneath her, end quote. Over the next 17 years, let me back up. Moved by this experience, Gary returned to the US and went into startup planning mode. He would build a new organization that would not simply plead for victims, but would actually rescue them. This organization would focus on 4 key areas: victim relief, perpetrator accountability, aftercare, and structural reform. In 1997, 1 year prior to Google's own start, Gary founded IJM with 1 employee, desks for 2 interns, in an office park. Over the next 17 years, IJM would establish operations in 10 countries and earn the right to investigate and prosecute crimes, working with local law enforcement and public prosecutors. You won't see these videos, but I've seen them. And what you'll see if you were actually at IJM headquarters is pictures of staff putting their lives on the line in the back of SWAT vans, raiding brothels, chasing out the aggressors, and rescuing the victims. It's a pretty powerful experience. The organization now includes 600 staff, including the investigations team led by Mark Kluge, the former director of NCIS. Yes, he did do 2 cameos on the TV show. A policy team led by Holly Burkhalter, former advocacy director for Human Rights Watch, as well as 200 lawyers. Today, IJM is a $50 million human rights agency that, in the words of The Atlantic's David Bradley, investigates and prosecutes the worst crimes, the worst evils around the globe. Human trafficking, sexual exploitation, slavery, police brutality, violence in all manifestation, but principally violence against the world's poor. Over the last years I've served on the board, I've worked in my career with over 40 nonprofits. And some of these nonprofits are amazing. I think they do incredible work. This is the first time I've worked with a nonprofit that has as its dashboard monitoring loss of life and limb to staff. tracking assassination attempts on their staff workers in the field. The work they do is really incredible. In 2013 alone, IJM rescued over 2,000 victims and secured over 100 convictions. That's in 1 year. Over the past 18 years, IJM has rescued over 18,000 victims, trained 13,000 officers and officials, and secured over 700 convictions, much of them in the past 5 years alone. However, more significant than these numbers is growing evidence that IJM's model is beginning to result in structural transformation and hopefully permanent change. A Gates Foundation-funded study, for instance, found that the number of minors available for exploitation in Metro, Cebu, and the Philippines plummeted 79% over 4 years. As a result of the investigation's work, in 2012, Gary received the Trafficking in Persons Report Hero Award. IJM was also one of 11 organizations that received a combined $11 million grant from Google.org in 2011. A significant portion of that grant was allocated to syndicate IJM's model to other nonprofits in India. And in the first 9 months of 2013 alone, that initiative and your money, Google's money, resulted in 830 victim rescues. Earlier this month, Oxford University Press released Gary's latest book, The Locust Effect, Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence, written with Victor Boutros, who's here in the front as well, a federal prosecutor. Let me just say, amongst the many endorsements that came from Bill Clinton, Anne-Marie Slaughter, Madeleine Albright, I think my favorite is from Madeleine Albright that says, the book is a much-needed argument for reducing violence against the poor and a demonstration through firsthand stories that are both shocking and true of why that goal is so vital. The book is both a vehicle for hearing voices rarely heard and a declaration of faith that with sufficient will, there are ways to halt the physical and financial exploitation of the disadvantaged. By reminding us that basic legal protections are not a privilege but a universal right, Gary Haugen has issued a moral call to arms that informs the brain and touches the heart. That's my hope for us today, that we'll keep our brains and our hearts open as we welcome Gary to Google. Please join me.
Thanks, Paul, very much for the extravagant introduction. I appreciate that you got all the material from my mom, and you did a great job with it. Thanks very much. And Kevin, thanks for dragging all your friends here. He told me this is the smartest people at Google, so congratulations for that. Or the people who couldn't afford to buy a book, so the first 10 who showed up got a book, so way to go. I'm also thanks that I'm glad you mentioned the hair. I did the Google Hangout in New York with your colleagues in New York, and Justin, who introduced me, that pretty much was the entire introduction, was just making fun of my hair. So this was really cool in the 50s. It really, really was. Anyways, it's marvelous to get to be with you. Thank you for the Google grant that allowed us to replicate the work in India. Thousands of people now have been rescued as a result of that, have been in places of literal slavery and are now free because of the willingness to engage in this work and to train others in how to do it. But I'd like to start this afternoon with a story much, much closer to home, actually just a few hours from here across the California border in Oregon, in a rural county where there was a woman not too long ago who was home alone at night. It's dark out, and she starts to hear an intruder begin to break open her side door. And she looks over and sees this man breaking his way into her house. It's terrifying, especially for her, because 2 weeks before, this same man in her community had put her in the hospital through an assault. And now he is clawing his way into her house. So she does what any sort of terrified person would do in their house in America. She picks up the phone and she calls 911. And what proceeds is a pretty horrific 10-minute conversation with this 911 operator who proceeds to explain that due to budget cuts in her rural county, law enforcement is only operating on the weekdays. And this is a weekend. And so she's simply explaining to her that you don't have law enforcement in your area. Listen to this for just a moment.
I don't have anybody sent out there. Obviously, if he comes inside the residence and assaults you, can you ask him to go away, or do you know if he's intoxicated or anything?
I've already asked him. I've already told him I was calling you. He's spoken before, but next door assaulted me.
obviously if he comes in and unfortunately has a weapon or is trying to cause you physical harm, that's a different story. The sheriff's office doesn't work up there. I don't have anybody to send.
The sheriff's office doesn't work up there. I don't have anybody to send. And of course, what happens is that man tears into that place, assaults her, chokes her, brutally rapes her. This is what happens if there's no law enforcement in your area, if there's no one to send for you. And yet, this book that we've written, The Locust Effect, what this is about is the story that there are about 4 billion people in our world who have no access to law enforcement. Especially for those who are poorest. A study was done by the UN that says, quote, listen to this, most poor people live outside the protection of law. Now that's a phrase that we can sort of read and just sort of let wash over us, but I think there's perhaps nothing quite like this phone call that allows us for just a moment to step into the shoes of the common poor person in the developing world who has no access to law enforcement and the terror that that represents in their lives. So that's the big number. 4 billion people do not have access to law enforcement that will actually protect them from violence. But what does that actually look like in the developing world? Well, it looks like this in Bolivia, where if you were to sexually assault a child in Bolivia, statistically you would actually be at greater risk of slipping in the shower and dying than you would have ever being sent to jail for that crime. Imagine a state of such impunity. Yes, it's completely against the law, but the problem for the poor is not that they don't get laws, it's they don't get law enforcement. This means in India and in other places in South Asia, if you enslave someone, literally enslave someone, you're at greater risk of being struck by lightning than you are of ever being sent to jail for the crime of slavery. This is a profound and massive phenomenon across the developing world that receives very, very little mention at all, which is the utter breakdown of basic criminal justice systems in the developing world. And what it has done then is unleash this epidemic of violence against the poor. And in The Locust Effect, this is really what we're trying to bring to the surface, because if I say the word global poverty, and if you try to bring sort of images to mind, what comes to mind? I mean, immediately you start to think, don't you, about sort of dirty shacks, you think about the dirty water, you think of sickness, you think of kids who can't go to school, you think of lack of capital, the need for microfinance, all those sorts of needs. One of the things that does not commonly come to the surface for us is the way that to be poor is to be chronically vulnerable to violence. But the problem is all that violence stays below the surface. Many of us have traveled to the developing world, and we've seen the dirty shacks, the dirty water, the hunger, the people who are sick, but very few of us will ever just visually see the violence. And so it takes something for us to be traveling into that sort of subterranean world to see what that violence looks like. And this is what we try to do in the opening chapters of The Locust Effect, is take you with the common poor person in the developing world to see what this violence is like. And we begin with the first category of most pervasive violence amongst the poor in the developing world, and that's basically gender violence. That's sexual violence and domestic abuse of women and girls. It is, in the collapse of law enforcement, open season on women and girls. In fact, gender violence accounts for more death and disability for women and girls between the age of 15 and 44 than malaria, cancer, car accidents, and war combined. This is why we're calling this epidemic everyday violence. Right? Because again, if we are familiar with the violence against the poor, most of the time we're thinking about the sort of catastrophic spasms of violence that are in the headlines, like the wars, the conflicts, and for sure those do decimate people's lives. And I know something about that myself, of course, having been the director of the genocide investigation in Rwanda. Whereas Paul mentioned, I just was given this list by UN military intelligence of 100 different mass graves and massacre sites. And we just tediously sorted through these thousands and thousands of people who'd been butchered by their neighbors. And when you're doing that work, especially as an investigator, what you're really trying to do is recreate visually, how did this happen from the forensic evidence that's there? And what is it like for that family pressed up against the wall of that stadium or that school or that cathedral as they see those machetes coming towards them. And the thing that was so manifest to me is that, yes, all these Rwandans were overwhelmingly very, very poor. The average Rwandan is living off about 65 cents a day. But in that moment of terror, when the machetes are coming towards you and your family, you're actually not crying out for some food. You're not crying out for a doctor. You're not crying out for a microloan. You're not crying out for a teacher and education. You're crying out for someone to restrain the hand of that machete. And this is the thing that makes violence different. It is a profound affliction of the poor, but it's different than the other problems that we engage. And this first category of massive abuse is gender violence. But like so many things, it stays below the surface. At the beginning of the book, I just invite readers to come with me to meet Lucilla, who's this woman that I met in a small town in the Andean Mountains in Peru. Very common woman, lives in a town that you would not necessarily notice or pay any attention to, except for the fact it has a rate of sexual assault that is worse than the sexual assault rates that were coming out of the worst war zones of the Congo. And if you follow through the story of Lucilla as she has to endure the rape and murder of her 8-year-old daughter, who's just dumped out on the street one night. And to follow Lucilla in what it is like for her to try to get justice in a totally broken criminal justice system. Gender violence is this massive epidemic against women and girls who are poorest and most vulnerable in the world. The second massive category of violence against the poor is a kind of violence that actually keeps people in poverty by force, and that's slavery. You may already know that there are about 30 million people held in slavery in the world today. These are not people held in slave-like conditions or metaphorical slavery, in actual slavery. At IJM, we've met thousands of them. And thanks to Google's work with us, have also been able to bring rescue to thousands. But there remain, actually, more people in slavery today than at any other time in human history. Mind-boggling, right? It's true that a smaller proportion of human beings are in slavery. That's true. A smaller proportion of the economy is produced by slave labor. That's true. But there's just so many more human beings that the absolute number of people in slavery is greater now than in any other time in history. One of the ways we try to bring readers into this, again, subterranean reality, is to take people to Bangalore, which is sort of the shining, high-tech capital in India, really sort of the icon of the booming economies of India. But an Indian lawyer takes me on a drive just a few minutes outside the beltway of Bangalore and shows me a brick factory where scores of people are held literally as slaves, working 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, making and carrying bricks. And anybody who's ever tried to run away from the facility is chased down, dragged back, and beaten in front of the others. In fact, when this one couple was able to escape, the owner of the brick factory was able to go to their village and actually kidnap and hold some family members and neighbors as hostages, and just publicly proclaim, until you bring me back my slaves, I'm going to continue to detain and torture their neighbors. In other words, he was very happy to let everyone know that he was exercising this kind of violence because he had zero fear that he would ever be brought to account under the law. So I got a chance to sit with Mariama, for instance, as she explained what it was like to live as a slave with her family and about 24 other of her neighbors as literal slaves in the 21st century. So the book takes us again to that subterranean world that we would otherwise have no idea about. The third sort of catastrophic form of violence against the poor, surprisingly perhaps, is police abuse. It turns out that the World Bank did this study called Voices of the Poor, which gave the tens of thousands of poor people just the chance to say, well, what is it about your poverty that's most painful to you? And the study was very rigorous, and one of the things it determined was that, quote, it was saying that police and courts in the developing world actually make poor people poorer and less secure. What? I mean, that's like a finding that says the hospitals in the developing world are making everybody sicker, or the schools are actually the places where everyone's prohibited from reading. This is what public justice systems have become in the developing world, places actually of harm. If you're poor, you run away from the police to be safe. You don't run to the police to be safe. One of the manifestations of this is the reality of pre-trial detention, where the police are able to throw people into jails and hold them without any charge or trial. In any given year, there's about 10 million people, overwhelmingly the poorest, who are held in pre-trial detention. What you don't see in that statistic, though, that are the tens of millions of people who are attached to those families. When the breadwinner is taken into prison, the way that devastates the capacity of that family, right, to move forward. So police abuse is the third and just horrific form of violence confronting the poor. The fourth, interestingly, is violent land theft. Just the way that the poor will have their land stolen from them by people of power and violence. In any given year, about 5 million people will get themselves violently ejected off of their land. And if you were to look at, well, who's most vulnerable to this, it turns out that widows are, especially widows in Africa. As the AIDS epidemic has devastated much of the male population, it leaves these families, right? And what happens is that stronger families will come and they'll just throw a widow like Susan and her kids off their land. One of the things that's amazing I had no understanding of was the idea that widows like Susan in the developing world support 500 million orphans. So you imagine a poor person who their sort of one asset for moving out of poverty is their little plot of land, right? Which gives them a little shelter, and then also the little garden where they're able to raise some food. But if you steal that land away, you've taken their most basic means for progress away from them, and you've left them in destitution. So that's the fourth sort of largest pervasive form of violence against the poor, is violent land theft. One of the things that we want to sort of bring forth from the book is not only this sort of subterranean world of violence that we might not be aware of, and why aren't we aware of it? It's hard to visualize, but secondly, there's human beings actively hiding it, right? Dirty water does not actively hide itself, nor do shacks, nor generally do diseases, but human beings, when they commit violence, they work hard to hide it. And likewise, the survivors and victims of abuse, also because of fear and shame, many times are also hiding it as well. So the book is trying to bring this back up to the surface, but not only that, but to help people begin to think about what are the implications of this for our dreams for the poor. That is, that they would be able to get out of poverty. And this is why we're calling it the Locust effect, because one of the pictures we want people to have is just the way that over the millennia, these poor farm communities are trying to scrape their way out of poverty by all this farm work. In a single day, would see the locusts descend and just destroy all of those years of hard work in a single day. And this is the way predatory violence works in the life of the poor. In a moment, they descend and destroy that work. But not only did they destroy the fruit of the farm work, but what's interesting about the locust is that farm work doesn't stop the locusts. Right? So not only does violence destroy the fruit of the efforts of the poor and the efforts of those who attempt to help them, but also the traditional things that we do to assist the poor, they don't stop the violence. So that suggests that we need to start talking about poverty differently and start doing things differently about poverty as well. So then that raises the question that we try to address a bit in the book is, my goodness, why are criminal justice systems so completely useless, backwards, brutal, and broken in the developing world? And there's 4 pretty interesting surprises that explain this. One of them, which if you've traveled in the developing world, you probably noticed, but it didn't really come to your mind what it was that you were seeing. And that is, you probably went to a restaurant and a hotel and you exchanged some money and you went to some other places, and almost everywhere that you and I would go in the developing world, someone will be there with a gun guarding you. Because with the collapse of public justice systems in the developing world, what's come into its place? Well, people with wealth and money and businesses have set up a completely parallel system of private security. So now, in fact, in a country like Guatemala, private security forces are 7 times larger than the public police force. In Africa, the largest employer on the continent is private security. In a way that almost we have not remarked upon at all, a massive social transformation has taken place in the developing world where security, instead of it being a public good that's provided to everybody through public institutions of policing and criminal justice system has been privatized. So now there's two kinds of people in the developing world. Those who can pay for their own security, and those who cannot afford to pay for security, cannot pay to be safe, and so they're not. So we now have to picture 2.5 billion people who live off less than $2 a day, who cannot purchase their own security and are living in this lawless chaos. What is the impact for them on trying to get out of poverty? There's several other explanations in the book that are pretty surprising about how it is that criminal justice systems and law enforcement has become so broken in the developing world. But then what we try to do is finally sort of pivot towards some hope, because I realize I've pretty much decimated your Wednesday right here. That was just going along pretty well, just fine. And then we hear about all this massive violence and human suffering. It's like, thank you very much, Gary. I'll take a nap now. But we've been at this work now for almost 20 years, and you'd think that we'd be pretty much in a fetal position somewhere, right? Because of all the sort of overwhelming corruption and abuse and violence. But actually, I have never been, and we have never been, more hopeful about coming to a tipping point of transformation in the developing world. And why is that? Where does the hope come from? The first place that hope comes from is history. Most of us just have never thought for a few minutes of like, well, where did our own reasonably functioning public justice systems come from? Our public justice system, our police and courts aren't perfect, for sure. I spent a career at the Department of Justice going after corrupt and brutal cops in the United States. And my co-author, Victor Boutros, does this currently and works in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. All the sort of abuses that happen anywhere in the world can also happen here. But we breathe like the invisible oxygen in the air. Functioning criminal justice systems that keep us safe. So we are outraged, are we not, when it turns out that law enforcement can't come to my house right now? That seems like a completely intolerable situation because we have reasonably functioning justice systems. But if you lived in the San Francisco Bay Area 120 years ago, what kind of law enforcement would you be experiencing? What I can tell you for sure is that it would be either non-existent, brutal, or corrupt, or completely captured by whatever local political party was in charge. In fact, what we do in the book is we set forth these various examples, these scenarios, and have you try to guess, is this one of the familiar cities that you enjoy and walk in currently, and a story of what their public justice system looked like 140 years ago? Or is this a current city in the developing world? And the descriptions are indistinguishable one from another. In other words, criminal justice systems that work and protect people, they don't descend from heaven as wonderfully operating. They always start out brutal and corrupt, and a fight is engaged to make them actually serve everybody so that everybody's protected from violence. And this is the history that most of us have just forgotten, but what it reminds us is that this is possible actually for those who are living in the developing world as well. So that's the other way that we begin to turn to look for hope too, because there actually are some stories and examples around the world now where some best practices are beginning to emerge of how the international community can join with local champions in the fight for trying to secure justice for the poorest. One of the best examples that we share in the book is the one that Paul alluded to, which was this experiment we did with the Gates Foundation in the second largest city of the Philippines called Cebu, which had a terrible problem with child sex trafficking. And we were given this grant to look at, well, let's see if we can do two things. Number one, can we stand up local law enforcement, the police and the courts, so they actually effectively enforce the law against child sex trafficking? Is that even possible? Because maybe it's so hopelessly corrupt and brutal that's not even possible. And if that does happen, will that actually reduce the amount of violence against kids in the commercial sex trade? Or is this just hopelessly some part of a massive problem of poverty that will never be affected by good law enforcement? Well, outside auditors went in before the project began and sort of drew a baseline of how much victimization of children there was in the commercial sex trade. And the goal of the project over a 4-year period of time was to try to demonstrate a 20% reduction in the victimization of these kids. That would have hit the ball out of the park, home run. Gates Foundation would have been super, super proud of this amazing winning project. But after 4 years of standing up local law enforcement, by deploying, as IJM does everywhere in the world, local, indigenous, Filipino lawyers, criminal investigators, and social workers to actually turn law enforcement around. What we saw after 4 short years was the auditors found a 79% reduction in the victimization of kids in the commercial sex trade. Why is that? Fundamentally, you learn 2 things. Number 1, crimes against the poor is crime of opportunity. You do it because you can get away with it. And it turns out that when you can't get away with it, you don't do it anymore. It also turns out that people who oppress the poor are not brave people. And when they start to feel a sense of reasonable risk that they could pay a price for that, they just leave them alone. There are a number of stories in the book that begin to show, not only from IJM, but from other NGOs around the world, other government organizations that are beginning to turn this plague of violence around. Our invitation to you is just really twofold. One is to help us change the conversation about poverty. All of you have probably been engaged because you even came here this afternoon. You probably have some heart for the struggle against poverty in our world. And we are at an inflection point in history of making really some tremendous improvements, but we're also stalling out when in terms of trying to help the 2.5 billion who are living off $2 a day, in them actually breaking through. And so what we would want to do is begin to make sure that we don't fail to include the problem of violence when we talk about poverty. So I would love it if you got a hold of the book, read it, got yourself educated, so you yourself are a capable advocate of just almost always asking the question, yeah, but what about the violence? And how are we dealing with the violence? And how are we strengthening local law enforcement to be able to address it? The second thing we would love for you to do is not only get the book, educate yourself, participate in the discussion, but right now there is a very, very important conversation going on with the United Nations about the Millennium Development Goals. You might have heard about this. In the year 2000, the UN put together from the international community a blueprint, the blueprint for trying to address poverty and to try to make massive progress over 15 years. So they came up with these 8 Millennium Goals. Well, in many respects, those have been really helpful and very powerful. But one of the grand mistakes that was made was that they drew up a blueprint to address poverty and didn't say a word about violence. This horrific force that undercuts so much of what's being done to try to assist the poor. An example of that, for instance, is girls' education in the developing world, right? Which is this amazingly powerful way to actually bring prosperity to a whole community, not only for the individual girls, but for that whole community. The problem is now studies show that one of the primary reasons girls don't go to school in the developing world is because of violence. Violence on the way to school, violence in the home that keeps them from going to school. And so we want to make sure that as the UN now is rewriting the Millennium Development Goals, so that in the year 2015, they'll launch sort of this new blueprint for addressing poverty. We just simply want to make sure, let's not leave out violence. It's a bit like the AIDS epidemic, right? When it began to really roll through the developing world in the 90s, and millions of people were being decimated. Really, you could not be serious about addressing poverty in the developing world if you were not willing to confront the problem of AIDS. Because whatever it is that you were doing, AIDS was going to show up and impact it. In the same way, we are hoping to engage the conversation about poverty in the developing world to say, unless you're dealing with the problem of violence and the lawlessness unleashed by the collapse of criminal justice system, it's going to roll over almost everything else you're trying to do. And so we would love it if you would go to the locusteffect.com/petition and just join a petition there that goes to the Secretary General of the UN. That is just, it ought to just be millions of common people who say, as they did in regard to the AIDS epidemic, hey, I'm not an expert about everything, but I care about this stuff, and it seems to make sense to me that if we don't address violence, we're not going to make the progress that we want in addressing poverty. Simple as that. But what I can tell you is that this stuff matters. And it's a tremendous way for you not only to engage yourself, but begin to mobilize all of your networks into the fight. So that's all I have to share this afternoon. I'd be happy to take questions or interaction. Or
in your first example,
Yeah.
the local police station had lost funding. And so my question to you would be, in these developing world, where the governments themselves are often lack funding, if you have any ideas for how to attack that angle.
Yeah. In many respects, we'll look in the developing world and we'll see, especially in low-income countries, you think, wow, they really don't have enough resources in the country to actually provide for decent law enforcement. Except when you look at all the dollars that are being spent on private security. And then you realize, oh, in the aggregate, this economy actually has plenty of money to be able to provide for public security, public law and order. And so what it takes is a groundswell of social demand within these communities. And that's why I want to emphasize a groundswell of demand to actually reallocate resources to the priority of providing for law enforcement. That's why I want to emphasize this is not a problem that's going to be solved from outsiders like paratrooping in and setting up American justice systems or something like that. This is a fight that the community itself, the nation, must own. And part of that is to rally the community to begin to demand that the public justice system is well provided for. So that's one of the things that International Justice Mission does, and a number of the other examples that we give in the book is how do we come alongside local champions in those communities and help resource them to be able to draw attention to the problem, but also realign resources so that they are provided for, so they're providing for a public justice system that cares for all. One of the amazing, of course, examples of this is the country of Georgia, which is a former Soviet republic, which in 2003 was ranked something like 145 out of 190 countries as most corrupt. It was ranked as more corrupt than any country that we work in, especially the police. But there was a demand amongst the citizenry and a new election that brought to bear leaders into power who began to attack corruption, and they started with police corruption. And the thing that they found was that police officers in Georgia would pay a $10,000 bribe in order to get a job for which they were paid by the government $10 a month. Why would you do that? Because basically you'd been given a license to then extort money from people. And then those high authorities in the Georgian government have also figured that out. Let me say, I get $10,000 bribe. We need a lot of police. Because the more police we have, the more bribe money I get. And so they have this bloated police force that was ill-trained and ill-equipped and completely abusive. So when this new leadership came in, the first thing they did is they fired 16,000 police officers in a single day, sent them home, and the city was safer. Then they rebuilt the police from the ground up, and they were able to pay them good wages, provide them with good equipment, and provide them with good management that was able to secure integrity to the police force. And the transformation for the common person is tremendous. So the resources are there, it's just how you allocate them. Yeah.
There's a sort of a stereotype about violence against the poor.
Yeah.
Which is maybe part of the self-defense mechanism, like you were saying, well, after this we'll feel like going and taking a nap and forgetting about the whole thing, which is, oh, those poor people over in the poor part of town, they have all this violence in their community. They're all beating each other up. But as long as they don't come into my neighborhood and break into my house, I just don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, especially, it seems like this might differ across the different categories of violence you were talking about, but to what extent are we looking at lawlessness within the poor community, and to what extent are we really looking at the people who are much better off going and systematically, like, taking the land, as you were saying, from the poor and enslaving the poor and so forth, as opposed to like domestic violence, which might be more of a poor on poor kind of thing.
It's both. It's poor on poor violence. It's sort of relatively poor against the poorest violence, right? So the opening story, for instance, of the rape and murder of the child in Bolivia in this town, that was committed by the wealthy family inside the town, who are not wealthy from our perspective, but in that town, they are the wealthier, powerful ones. So it is sort of the strong preying upon the weak. But it is also true that, for instance, the people who run slave operations in rice factories, brick factories, these are people of substantial economic power and substantial political power. So those kinds of crimes, and especially the land theft, those are also crimes that have substantial economic power behind them. So you are dealing with people who are actually making money off the violence. There's not a lot of people making money off malaria. There's not a lot of people making money off of contaminating water or making hospitals run badly. You could make up an instance, I guess, in which that's the case. But for the most part, that's not the case. But there is a massive business of economic advantage from violence against other human beings. And if you don't have a good system that's prepared to fight that, that's going to roll all over the most vulnerable. Yeah.
Two kind of related questions, so
Yeah.
or it might just be that I'm trying to jam two in. One, you made a good case for how violence affects the poor.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the, flipping that arrow around and thinking about how does poverty actually create violence? How much of this is from people being poor and having no other opportunities? How much does that impact the police situation where, you talk about police who are very underpaid? And getting this into the equation, the second part of the question is, where's the most leverage to affect this? There were some kind of big numbers thrown out around 4 billion people without law enforcement protection, 30 million in slavery.
Yeah.
Where do we get the most leverage to actually have the most impact on a problem like this?
From our perspective, there's no question that the biggest leverage comes from a credible criminal deterrent in the community. Because crime proceeds along sort of elasticity to risk. And different kinds of crime is sensitive to risk in different ways. So if you have social pathology, sort of deviancy, the pedophilia sort of a crime where somebody just out of deviancy is going to commit that crime, and actually it's not very responsive to risk. You can ratchet up the law enforcement on that, and those people commit those crimes anyways, and they end up going to jail. So it's not very responsive to risk. Also true with crime of necessity, where someone feels like, I got to commit this crime. And that's what a lot of state crime is that's committed by governments. They think, I have to torture this guy in order to stay in power. So this is a crime of necessity. So that responsiveness to risk is also not that great. Also crime of desperation, where you feel like, I got to steal the bread, I have to hijack the car because my family's starving, and so this is necessity. That's also not very responsive to risk. But the vast, vast, vast majority of crime against the poor is crime of opportunity. You do it because you can get away with it. And what you find there on the curve is that as soon as there is a little increase in the risk, that falls very, very sharply, especially things like any kind of crime of opportunity that produces an economic reward. That's certainly like slavery. That stuff drops off like 79% in a 4-year period of time when people who are doing it just for the purposes of making money find that the risk calculation has changed. So we have seen the greatest returns from just making sure that those who would be drawn to that crime against the poor feel like they have a reasonable chance of going to jail. That means you get rid of all the soft crime. That will leave you with a hard crime, which is the crime of desperation, the crime of necessity, the crime of social deviancy. And in the West, that's what we're trying to mostly battle in our communities. But we have a really different struggle in the developing world, where there's a tremendous amount of soft crime, crime of opportunity that hasn't been addressed at all. And we will have to eventually get to the other stuff, but right now the massive numbers are coming from just pure opportunity. Yeah. The second question was about the prior question.
The first was, I think, what you mentioned, which is the crimes of necessity or desperation, that how much does poverty itself create the violence versus violence exacerbating the poverty?
It's certainly a cycle. They're interrelated. But it's a mistake to imagine that you have to wait to solve poverty before you can drastically reduce the amount of violence against the poor. You can address violence because it's driven by the incentives of the perpetrator substantially, right? And so those risk calculations are very, very powerful. You will need to address the other sort of complicated social causes for crime, but a massive amount of it can be addressed by addressing the incentives of the perpetrators. Unlike dirty water or disease, they don't have human will behind it. All crime does. And so you affect the incentives of the of the perpetrators quite powerfully and faster than you might otherwise think.
I realize you're focusing on the developing world, and you just mentioned that, say, in a society like ours in the United States, we deal with, maybe you say, less of this soft crime,
Yes.
more of the hard crime. I feel like we have the same thing happening in the United States where money pays for protection. For instance, our property taxes pay for a safe neighborhood, and the poor neighborhoods may not get lights, which whoever's causing the crime, whether it's for economic opportunity by the more powerful or out of desperation, the same people are suffering, which are the people in those communities.
Yeah.
Or why do people feel that they don't trust law enforcement in the United States? Or you can pay for a good representation in court, or you can get a state-appointed one that only gives your case 5 seconds. And so I don't see that those problems don't exist in the quote non-developing worlds. Have you given that thought, or are there others doing similar lines of research for?
Yeah, absolutely, and that is the case. And as I said, the first half of my career was addressing those failures actually here in the United States. So there's no abuse taking place overseas that I haven't seen somewhere here in the United States. What we do have is just massively greater resources to address them. But it's also true that those with wealth and money supplement the provision of public service with private security and with private legal representation and so forth. And so it is certainly true that you get better security the wealthier you are in the United States and in any country. That's true. But the question is whether or not you're going to have any sort of even reasonable baseline of protection for those who are poorest. You might look at Catherine Boo's recent book on, I think, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, where she lived for, I think, 3 years in a slum in India. And she's this amazing journalist who's actually written a lot about the failures of law enforcement in the United States, too. But she wrote about just sort of the realities of poverty in the slum. And one of the things when she came home and she was on NPR talking, she says, well, the one thing I can say is different about coming home to the United States is that the basic level of opportunity for law enforcement to provide basic order in the community is completely just order of magnitude different. So it's also true, for instance, that the poor, like we have mass incarceration of the poor in the United States because of poor legal services in many respects. But what's true in the developing world is that if you're too poor to have an attorney, you get no attorney. So you don't get a sleepy attorney or a drunk attorney, or you get none at all. And it's also overwhelmingly likely that if you're a poor person in the developing world, you will appear in court in a proceeding that is conducted in a language you do not understand. So you will appear, because it's actually conducted in the colonial language, whether that's English or Spanish or French, because the legal institutions were set up by the colonial powers and they have never been re-engineered. This is the other sort of amazing thing. The laws have changed. Post-colonial, wonderful embedding of human rights standards in domestic law. But the pipeline that actually delivers those rights is law enforcement, which has been set up by a colonial model and never changed. And so one of the things that that manifests is that you don't have any representation at all, and you do it in a proceeding that is conducted in a language you don't understand. So imagine you're accused of a crime, you're thrown into a proceeding in which you have no legal protection, and you can't understand a word. And then you just get shuffled off to jail, and you're sort of asking, as I see this many times, the defendant who's poor asking the guard, of course, who has no education, is illiterate generally, but to ask the guard, can you just please explain what just happened? Right? So every society needs to carry vigilance on behalf of those who are poorest and most vulnerable, who are going to get run over by a criminal justice system. But the utter collapse of these systems in the developing world is something, as we wrote in another article, you almost have to see to believe, and we're hoping to just bring that to the surface. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, I was just curious if you had any thoughts on any ways that information technology has impacted this problem at all. Like, have you seen this through your work? Are there things that we could be doing, a big place like Google that could help?
Yeah, massively so. And in fact, we have had some opportunities to bring out our director of investigations, for example, who is formerly the director of NCIS, to talk about the amazing ways that actually technology can be leveraged on behalf of the poor to fight much of this crime. And in many ways in the developing world, these technological advances are leapfrogging in ways that are able to empower the poor tremendously. When I started doing this work, I know it's dating me a bit, but there were no cell phones in the developing world. And now we give cell phones to slaves inside brick factories, and they are able to communicate with us. And then, there's using imagery to find places that are more likely to be using slave labor, the way of creating sort of hot spots of where abuse is taking place through data. The truth is, though, every word I just used, I was acting like I knew I was talking about. You guys are more likely to be the ones to actually get to know the needs and then to begin to dream and imagine what technology can do. So that would be another wonderful thing for you guys to read the book, acquaint yourself with the problems, and then begin to imagine with us the way in which technology can be leveraged. Because one of the just absolute things that technology is able to do is to bring transparency to what's happening by empowering people to signal what is happening or communicate what's happening, and to shrink the world and to do it real time. I think technology is fundamentally just going to make it harder and harder and harder to get away with these things. And that is what the victims of abuse and violence need most, is for other people to know about it. Because if you think about it, what does a violent criminal always do? And it's part of the thing that makes them so scary, is they hide what they do in the dark. And they try to intimidate other people from seeing it. Why do they do that? They do it because they're afraid. Criminals are fundamentally afraid that if other people know what's going on, they won't be able to withstand the power that we brought to bear upon them. So the way that technology can bring us much more to actually be transparent about what's going on in the world and empower even the weakest to be able to do that, I think we're going to be living in a very different and safer world for the poor.
Just join me in giving Gary a hand. Thanks for having him coming over. Appreciate it.